Welcome to this video interview. I'm Jennifer Brown, Director of Training for the College of Preachers, and it's my pleasure to introduce my guest today, the Reverend Trevor Marshall. Trevor is the National Giving Ministry Advisor for the National Giving Team of the Church of England. And as well as this, he is also priest in charge of 2 rural parishes in the Diocese of Chichester. Prior to ordination, Trevor was a project manager in the financial services industry today, and Trevor and I are going to be talking about preaching about giving. So welcome, Trevor. It's a delight to have you with me today.
It's good to be here, Jennifer. Thanks for the invitation.
And if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump straight in and ask, why is it important that churches talk about giving?
I think churches can only thrive in the community through the generosity of the worshipping community. Worshipping communities can be generous in time and talents, but there is still an underlying need for money to be there to enable mission and ministry. Preaching about generosity isn't just about asking for generosity, but it's encouraging us to have a response to God's generous love to us. In the generosity that God shows us, we should be able to respond in a way that enables us to be generous to Him, which then enables churches to be generous in being able to preach the gospel within the communities in which they serve. Giving to God as a response to His generosity should be a key part of our personal discipleship, and it's something that preaching should reflect, not just as a one-off event, but something that's embedded into our church and how we see our church on a day-to-day basis. So preaching about generosity is the underlying benefit of God's generosity towards us.
Thank you. I think that concept of generosity is really, really important. And I know that it's been present in church teaching down the ages, which has always emphasized the importance of giving to the poor and indeed giving to the work of the church. That being the case, why do we often find it so difficult to tackle the subject of money and giving in our preaching today?
I think the problem about talking about money is the fact it's just not talked about within our society. We generally don't talk about what we earn, how we earn it, and more importantly, how we spend it. We tend to be very private about our financial affairs, and it can be very difficult talking into this space. Preaching about money feels that we're invading people's privacy. It can feel that we're almost demanding money with menaces, trying to say to people, if you don't give to your church, bad things will happen. Whereas actually we should be overcoming our reticence and talk openly about the need for money within the church environment and how we can use it to proclaim the gospel within our communities.
Thank you. That's really interesting, that idea that it feels like we're invading people's privacy when we talk about money, that somehow our money and what we do with it isn't part of our public persona. That's quite an interesting idea. You and I are meeting in Advent, when the church is starting to look forward to Christmas and the gift of the Christ child, and that theme of the gift of the Christ child often comes up in Christmas preaching. Alongside of which it's not uncommon to hear preachers talk of God's free gift of grace and salvation. So how do we combine the idea of God's gift to us being free and the need to give to support the work of the church in response to God's generosity?
I think by having that understanding that God's generosity to us should invoke a responsibility for us to be generous back. If we understand that God is generous in all that He does for us, then our generosity is a response to that generous love that God shows us. But at this time of Advent and Christmas, it's important to remember how generosity goes throughout the nativity story, not just the generosity of God's gift to us of the Christ child. But if we look at Mary and Joseph and the key players within the nativity story, they have a generous response to God's calling. Mary and Joseph take on the responsibility for bringing the Son of Man into the world. The wise men come with generous gifts. The shepherds leave behind their work and they come and worship with Christ. So we hear that there is sacrifice and giving amongst the actors in the nativity story in response to God's calling. And the sacrifice that was made then should be reflected on what we do today. It's giving us a foundation for the church that we can build on. And as part of our own discipleship, we should be looking to have that generous response to God's calling so that we can support his church in our communities and the places that we're called to preach in.
Thank you. If a preacher wanted to tackle that whole subject of money, generosity, and giving to the church, what approach would you recommend that he or she take? Where should we start with our preaching on this subject?
Well, I think if we look at how money is asked for by other organisations such as charities, we watch television adverts for charities, we read their direct mailing, we may get approached by them in the street, but they will all tell us that we will be, if we give X pounds, we'll provide a meal for a homeless person. Y pounds give somebody a room for the night. Z pounds will provide a phone line for someone to contact a charity. We're told what that need is and how we can address that need. It gives the potential donor an understanding of how their generous donation can be used by that charity to make a difference to someone's life. So if we want to talk about money, generosity and giving within our church, we need to make it known how those generous donations will be used and what difference they'll make to the life of the church. We know that within churches, more than 3/4 of the income from churches is actually from generous donations from the worshipping community. So we know that it is an important part of our ministry. The income that we receive is used to provide ministry and mission, to provide the buildings that we worship in and that we can welcome people into. So what we're doing in our churches makes a difference to the lives of the people. So we need to talk about what difference we are making in order to be able to then talk about money. When I talk to groups of ordinands, curates and incumbents, I generally am talking to them about generosity. But I always ask them at the beginning, does anybody have a £10 note? I find it interesting nowadays to see how few people actually carry a £10 note on them. But there's normally somebody, after much rifling around in wallets and purses, that will produce the £10 note, hold it up proudly. I'll go towards them, take the £10 note, put it in my pocket and walk away. Never telling them what it's going to be used for, how I'm going to spend it, or why I even asked for it in the first place. And I feel that sometimes preaching on generosity within churches can feel a little bit like taking that £10 note. I do, at the end of the day, give it back to them because I am a generous person. But we should make that effort to talk about it within a culture that is able to talk about generosity and giving in a way that allows us to respond to God's generosity and make our churches and our worshipping communities aware of our financial situation. Nearly everybody that I talk to has come across somebody that assumes that the church is rich. But the richer the church is, the richer it can be within the community to promote the gospel and to preach good news. We're not alone in preaching about generosity. Every church throughout the land has to struggle with this. And there are some excellent resources available through the Church of England, the Building the Generous Church part of the Church of England website. Diocesan websites also have materials, and there are numerous other websites where materials are available so that people can go and start preaching about generosity. We did an exercise with one diocese where we gave them the lectionary readings for the whole year, and they farmed them out to various writers who were all asked to write a little piece on generosity relating to the readings for that week. And successfully, they've managed so far 18 months of lectionary readings where you can talk about generosity on almost any week within the year. So it's a case of getting on with it, I think, is the answer. But creating that culture where generosity and giving is seen to be part of discipleship, and it's not somewhere where it is purely asking people for money week after week after week. It's asking people to respond to God's generous love to us.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, particularly the idea of starting from the point of what your giving will help us do. Even if it means we can keep the heating on in the church, and then people who can't afford to keep their heating on in their homes can come and be warm in the church. Everything makes a difference.
Yeah, it is one of those areas where the more we talk about it, the more we understand what generosity can do, not just to keep the church open, but to keep it as a place for our communities and a place where we can preach those gospels.
And speaking of the gospel and the gospels, when we look at the gospels, we see that Jesus actually spoke a great deal about money and giving. He talked about people giving to the temple and giving to care for the poor. You've spoken already about this collection of writings about the lectionary passages. So which particular passages of scripture from the Gospels, but also from the rest of the Bible, would you recommend are as being particularly good passages to use for someone who wanted to preach about giving and generosity?
Well, one of my favorite gospel verses, which talks about generosity, but talks not about Jesus preaching about generosity, but a practical example of somebody being generous and being generous to Jesus. And it's from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 3. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. This single verse tells us about living a generous life. Mary wasn't just generous with her money, being generous with that expensive perfume, the pound of nard. She was generous with her time, sitting at the feet of Jesus, putting his needs first, a lesson we can all learn in terms of being generous to Christ. She was generous with her attention. She wasn't being distracted by what was around her. We always hear the Martha and Mary opposites, but Mary was the one that sat there, was generous with her time, and was listening to what Christ was saying to her. She's also very generous with her talents. She was being tender and caring to Jesus. She was there with him, doing what she could in order to give him the comfort that he needed at that time. And I find this an interesting one. She was generous with her reputation. Sometimes we find it easy to hide our Christianity in front of others. And yet here was Mary wiping the feet of Jesus with her hair, something that was completely countercultural within the times. And yet she was generous She also was generous with her comfort. She was comforted Jesus at the time that he needed it. And of course, we know that she was generous with her wealth, giving Jesus that pound of perfume that we know cost about a year's wages. So in all of those, in one simple action, Mary was generous in so many ways. Now, of course, there are many, many verses that talk about generosity, wealth, giving, money. In fact, there's over 1,000 verses in the whole of the Bible. I think it runs in about 8% of the entire Bible. It has something to do with money. So it's a rich resource to be able to talk about money. But this one verse just gives me so much hope that we can be generous in so many ways in order to respond to Christ's love for us.
Thank you for developing that verse for us. I found that really interesting because if I remember rightly, if we look at the rest of that story, of course, there's the complaint that the perfume should have been sold and the money given to the poor. And although John then says, of course, Judas just wanted the money so he could skim some off the top. But that, and Jesus's response kind of suggests to us that giving to the poor is important, but it's not the only giving that's important.
Yes. And I think this is something that we need to be aware of, is that unless we have that solid foundation within the church that can enable ministry, we won't be able to go out and be a missional church if we're scratching around trying to pay for the cost of the heating bill. We need to be generous in order to enable us to go out and be missional, to be able to preach the gospel outside the four walls of the church. So, yes, this tells us so much about how we should be living our lives as generous disciples of Christ.
We come to the final question I have for you today. I began this interview by asking you why it's important that churches talk about giving generally. And my final question brings us back to that first question in a way. Why is it important that we be willing to talk about money and giving, not just in church meetings or over coffee, but as we've been discussing today, from the pulpit in our sermons? Why is it important that that message come from the front?
I think it is important to talk in small groups and over cups of coffee, and one-to-one, small groups, larger groups. But the culture of the church is dictated by what is said from the pulpit. From the front of the church is where cultural change takes place. By the whole of the worshipping community, old and young, from no matter what background, if they can hear that our church is generous in so many ways, not just in what we give to the poor, but how we deal with our communities, I think that preaching from the front embeds that sense of culture, that we know that we are a generous people within God's church. I think that that message that is got across gives people the chance to respond in whatever way they feel appropriate. We talk about tithing, and the number of times I hear people talking of tithing, but then they start asking questions about, is it before or after tax? It's not about that. It's about generating that culture of generosity that enables us to give as we see fit in response to what God has given us. And I feel that that can only come from good preaching and impacting the lives of all of the disciples within the worshipping community.
Trevor, thank you very much. It's been an interesting discussion and a real pleasure to talk with you today.
Jennifer, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Take care. God bless.